We continue now at the top of Daf Lamed Heyamid Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 35b. On the previous summit, the Gemara brought the opinion of Rebbe Lozer that Pigel Bo'emurim Nispaglu Parim. This is talking about the Parim HaNisrafim. These are the bulls that are totally burned. For example, the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor. So if the Kohen has the wrong intention, Bo'emurim, in terms of burning the sacrificial portions on the Mizbeach, he has intention outside of the proper time, so then the Parim become Pigel in that situation. But in the reverse, let's say there's a wrong intention in terms of the Parim, that does not create Pigel in that situation. And the Gemara brought a Bryce on the previous Amud, and the Gemara suggested that the Bryce is saying the exact same thing, that again, Chishev Bo'emurim, if the person had the wrong intention by the Emurim, that the Parim would become Pigel. And the Gemara says, no, that's the wrong inference to draw from the Brysa. Rather, Hachisha Be'emurin, all the Brysa means is if he has the wrong intention by the sacrificial portions, so then Nispaglu Emurin Atzmon, it just means that the Emurim themselves become Pigel, but the rest of the Par does not necessarily become Pigel according to the Brysa, and therefore this Brysa does not necessarily support the opinion of Rebbe Lozer. Rashi explains Emurin Atzmon, the Emurim themselves become Pigel, meaning the Yoseres HaKaveh, that's the lobe of the liver, V'hakloyos, and the kidneys, those are the parts that are burned on the Mizbeach, those can become Pigel. You have the wrong intention by those, they become Pigel. Avolo basar, but not the meat. She'ein mispagil b'davar shel gufa shel zevach ela davar hamefagil. It could be, not like Rebbe Lozer. Rebbe Lozer said that it's possible for something that it doesn't necessarily cause Pigel, but it can become Pigel. But now we're saying, no, maybe the Brisa doesn't hold like that. Maybe the Brisa holds that the basar of the Parim HaNisrafim, they're not going to become Pigel. They themselves are not a davar hamefagil, that they cannot create Pigel. To kaven de lo chashav achila le'inyan Pigel, since it's not considered achila as far as Pigel, lo chashav nami achila le'inyan ifkule, so it's also not considered to be achila in terms of becoming Pigel. It's possible again that this Brisa does not follow Rebbe Lozer. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here a proof to Rebbe Lozer from the following Mishnah in Meseches Me'ilah, Parim HaNisrafim, with regards to the bulls that are burned entirely, Useirim HaNisrafim, and the goats that are burned, Moalin Bohen Mishahuktashu, from the time that they are consecrated, there is a liability to Me'ilah if you misuse them, and Nishchatu, once they are slaughtered, Hochshru Lipasel B'Tvul Yom of a Mechusar Kippurim Uvalina, so then they're prepared to be disqualified by a Tvul Yom. A Tvul Yom is Tameh, he immersed that day, but it still hasn't waited for the end of the day to be totally pure. A Mechusar Kippurim is also Tameh, he's lacking atonement, he hasn't brought the carbon. Uvalina, and they're also disqualified being left overnight. Rashi explains, Huchsharu Niskanu Likvo Apsul and Halalu, again they're prepared to have these disqualifications. B'Tvul Yom of a Mechusar Kippurim Im Nagu Bahen, if a Tvul Yom or Mechusar Kippurim touch them, again they are disqualified. And the Gemara continues and brings its proof from this Mishnah. My lav, is it not? Linas basar, we're talking here about the meat being left overnight. Ushma minon, we see from this Mishnah, migo de pasla balina, that just like there's a disqualification of being left overnight, pasla b'machshava, the meat is also disqualified if you had a machshava of lina, meaning a machshava, an intention outside of the proper time, and that essentially is like Rebbe Lozer, because again we said that if you have a wrong intention with regards to the meat by the Parim HaNisrafim, that's not going to create a disqualification of Pigel. The reason it doesn't create Pigel is because, again, the meat is not eaten. That's something that's normally not eaten when it comes to the Parim HaNisrafim, which are burned in their entirety. But yet the meat is going to become Pigel. Let's say there was a machshava, an intention outside of the proper time with regards to the Emurim. So you see exactly what Rebbe Lozer was saying, that you make that distinction. You can have something which doesn't create Pigel, but it can become Pigel. And Rashi explains, me the pasla lina, from the fact that being left overnight creates a disqualification, pasla nami machsheves lina, also an intention of being left overnight. That's an intention outside of the proper time, creates that disqualification of Pigel. And my lav linas basar, isn't it talking about linas basar? Katani shem lo nifsal, if the meat is left overnight, it's disqualified. V'hu adin lemachsheves lina, and the same would be true by intention of being left overnight, intention outside of the proper time, sheposelas bibasar, that the meat again would become disqualified, and you see exactly what Rebbe Lozer was saying. And Rashi notes, now granted, let's say you had intention of the wrong time by the meat itself, lo tidok mina, that you can't infer from there, because as we said, the intention outside of the proper time has to be something that it's normal to eat it. And the Brisa earlier also said explicitly, they agree that if the intention outside of the proper time was to eat the bulls, lo asa klum, that's nothing. Afilu lifsol, even to create a disqualification. Not only does it not create pigul, it doesn't create a disqualification. Miu, nevertheless, hadaikinan minod demachshevas linas emurim, we should be able to infer from this that intention of leaving the emurim overnight, mefagelas habasar, would still make the basar pigul. Rebbe Elazar, that goes like Rebbe Elazar. Again, Rebbe Elazar's distinction, something might not create pigul, but it itself can be subject to the liability in terms of pigul, and that's what seems to be being said in this Mishnah. And the Gemara continues and says, Lo, no, linas emurim, that's not necessarily what this Mishnah means. Maybe it only applies to the emurim. We're talking about leaving the emurim, the sacrificial portions, overnight. They can become pigul because they're able to create pigul, but it would not apply to the meat of the parim hanisrafim. Rashi explains, Lo, no, linas emurim, we're talking about linas emurim. To katani de paslo ha-emurim nifsalim belina katani. We're talking about, when it says disqualification, it means the emurim are nifsalim belina. Ha-emurim nifsalim belina katani. We're talking about the emurim being disqualified left overnight. With the chavasa pshot minad demachsheves linas emurim mefagels be'emurim. And again, we're just saying a wrong intention outside the proper time in terms of emurim that would create pigul in the emurim, and therefore this does not necessarily support Rebbe Elazar. But the Gemara continues, Hamida Katani Seifa, but from the fact that it says at the end of the same Mishnah, it says Kulon Moalin Bohen, there's Me'ila by all of them, Al Beis Hadeshin, by the Beis Hadeshin, which is where it was burned, Ad Shayuta Chabasar, until the meat melts. The point is that clearly the end of the Mishnah is talking about the meat. So Mechlal Dereisha Linas Basar, so then doesn't that imply that the beginning of the Mishnah is talking about leaving the basar overnight? Because if the end is talking about basar, shouldn't the beginning of the Mishnah also be talking about basar? The Gemara says not necessarily. Midi area, does it have to be that way? Ha-kedisa, each one can be talking about its own item. Reisha, emurim, the beginning of the Mishnah is talking about the emurim. V'seifa, basar, and the end of the Mishnah is talking about basar, it's talking about the meat. Rashi explains, until the meat melts, Garsina Meseches Me'ila means until it melts, until it's scorched. V'lo Garsina Misha Yutach, it's not from when it melts. Tim Kain Havalei Davar Shanasis Mitzvah, because at that point in time already, it's something that the mitzvah is complete. The Ein Mo'alin Bo, and then there actually would not be Me'ila. Aval Ad Sheyatach, but until it melts, Da'akati Isput Sorech Avodas Kavod, there's still a need of Avoda there, Kari Buhu Mikad Shei Hashem, then that would be called Mikad Shei Hashem. And the Gemara continues, Mosiv Rabba asks the following question against Rebbe Elazar from a Brisa. The Brisa says, Ve'elu she'ein mefaglin ve'ein mispaglin. The following are not mefaglin and not mispaglin. Tzemer shebarashe kavasim, the wool that's at the heads of the sheep. V'sar shebezakin tiyashim, and the hair that's at the beard, that's on the beard of the goats. V'ha'or v'harotef v'hakifa, and the hide and the gravy and the sediment. V'ha'alol, and the sinews of the neck. V'hamorah, and the crop, v'atzamos, and the bones, v'hagidin, and the sinews, and the sinews, v'hakarnayim, and the horns, v'atzalafayim, and the hooves, v'hashlil, v'hashilya, and the fetus, and the placenta, v'chalev hamukdashin, and the milk of the karbanos, uveitze torin, and the eggs of the turtle doves, kulon lo mefaglin v'lo mispaglin. All of these don't create pigul, and they're not included in the liability to pigul. Ve'in chayavin alein mishum pigul, and there's no liability to pigul. No Tame, there's also no liability to noser and tame. These are all items which aren't really eaten, so they're not included at all. And somebody who offers them outside of the mikdash is going to be pater, is going to be exempt. And this is exactly the opposite of what Rebbe Elazar said, because Rebbe Elazar said by these items you can make a distinction. They're not normally eaten, so they don't create pigul, but if the carbon becomes pigul, there can be liability if these items are eaten. And so that's what the Gemara now says. My lav, is it not? Lo mefaglin hazevach, they don't cause the carbon to be pigul. V'lo mispaglin machma zevach, and they don't become pigul if the carbon, because the carbon is pigul. And so therefore, again, that would be a proof against what Rebbe Elazar said. And the Gemara says, no, lo mefaglin hazevach, it might mean that they don't cause the carbon to be pigul. V'lo mispaglin machmas atzman, and it might mean that they're not going to become pigul from themselves if you had wrong intention about them. But if you had wrong intention about the rest of the carbon, maybe they actually would be included, and therefore it could be like Rebbe Elazar. But the Gemara continues and asks, if so, hadikatani seifa, that which it says at the end, it says kulan lo mefaglin v'lo mispaglin. It seems to repeat the same thing, lo mefaglin v'lo mispaglin. Hasu lamali. What do you need to say that again for? But the Gemara says to that, v'lataimech, but according to your reasoning, ein chayavin olav mishum pigul. It also seems to repeat it a third time. It says there's no liability for pigul. Hasu lamali. What's the point of saying it again? Ela aidi deba limisni. But the reason why we're repeating this, it really all is the same thing. It's not to teach anything extra. Ela aidi deba limisna noser v'tamei. Since we also want to teach the halachas of noser and tamei, so tana pigul. So we learn pigul as well again, and we repeat it. Hachanamin here also aidi deba limisni hamalame and bachutz. Since we want to teach the halacha that if it's offered outside the mikdash, so tana nami v'chulan lo mefaglin v'lo mispaglin. So again, we repeat the halacha lo mefaglin v'lo mispaglin, but the repetition is not meant to teach anything extra. And again, it might be that it's not saying lo mispaglin machmas zevach. It might simply be saying lo mispaglin machmas atzman. And Rashi explains, v'lo mispaglin machmas hazevach. Again, they don't become pigul because of the zevach. Im chishev lechol mibsar hazevach. If he thinks to eat from the meat of the carbon or lahaktir emurin chutz lizman, or to burn the emurin outside of the proper time, v'lo nispaglu elu leyonesh b'achilos kares. If these items are eaten, there's not going to be a punishment of kares. U'tiyuvta the Rebbe Lazar, and this would be a refutation of Rebbe Lazar, tahacha shlilu morah tanan, because here it says the shlil, it says the fetus, and the morah, the crap, where Rebbe Lazar again made that distinction and said that these are items that don't create pigul, but they are included if the carbon is pigul. If one eats from them, he is going to be chayiv kares. Here it's saying there is no kares, therefore it seems to be against Rebbe Lazar. And again, the Gemara went on to say that no, what the Brisa simply means is that they don't create pigul machmas atzman. It means they don't create pigul, and they won't become pigul machmas atzman. But if the carbon is pigul, then in fact, if you eat from them, there is a punishment of kares. And the Gemara continues, Rava Amar Rava says, Afanon Nami Tanin, in our Mishnah it also supports what Rebbe Lazar said, because what does it say in our Mishnah? Hashocheres hamukdashim, if one slaughters the female animal karbonos, lechol shalil o shilya, again, to eat the fetus or the placenta bachutz outside of the proper time, lo pigil, so then it's not going to be pigil. V'hamolek es hatorim lechol beitzeyem bachutz, and if somebody does malika on the turtle doves to eat their eggs outside of the proper time, lo pigil, that is not going to create pigul. Again, these are things that are not going to create pigul. V'hadar tani, but then it says chalev hamukdashim uveitzei torim. When it comes to the milk of the mukdashim, when it comes to the eggs of the turtle doves, ein chayev alein mishum pigul noser v'tamei. There's no obligation of pigul noser and tamei if you eat from those items. Hashalil v'shilya, but it sounds like by the fetus and the placenta chayavim, there is a liability if you eat from them if the carbon is pigul, and so they don't create pigul, but they themselves can be included in the liability of pigul. Elalav shvamina, don't we see from here, kan machmas hazevach. In one case, again, if it's because the whole carbon is pigul, there is a liability, but kan machmas atzman, but if it's because of them, they can't create the pigul. Shvamina, so you see exactly that distinction which Rebbe Lazar was making. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Tanan Hasam, we learned in a Mishnah over there. This is a Mishnah later on. Uvale Mumin, the Tanakama says that Bale Mumin, animals with a blemish, are included in the halacha, that if they're brought on the Mizbeach, they have to be removed from the Mizbeach. Rabbi Akiva Machshir B'Bale Mumin. Rabbi Akiva says, if an animal with a blemish is brought on the Mizbeach, it is not removed, it is left on the Mizbeach. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Chia bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says, Lo hichshir Rabbi Akiva ela bedoken sheba'ayin. Rabbi Akiva only said that you leave the animal that has a blemish, you leave it on the Mizbeach. Let's say it's a blemish in the cornea of the eye. Ho'elu ksherim ba'ofo, since this kind of this kind of blemish is kosher by birds, it's not so recognizable. And furthermore, v'hu shakidem hekdeshes mum, this is only true if the animal is consecrated before it developed the blemish. So then again, in that situation, Rabbi Akiva would say, as long as it satisfies these conditions, that the animal remains on the Mizbeach. Umod Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva would admit, ba'olas nekeva, let's say you have a carbon-ola, you bring as a carbon-ola a female animal, and really a carbon-ola should only be a male animal, not a female. So that's also sort of like a blemish, because it's not the right kind of animal. So decheman dekodam muma lehekdesh adami, that's similar already to the blemish preceding being consecrated, and therefore Rabbi Akiva would say an olas nekeva should be removed from the Mizbeach. And the Gemara continues, Meisiv Rabbi Zeira. Rabbi Zeira asks on this explanation of Rabbi Akiva from the Brisa we brought above, Hamalim mehen bachutz, if somebody offers from them, from these parts of the animal that are not fit to go on the Mizbeach, if those are offered outside of the Beis HaMikdash, so pater, so then the person is exempt from offering the carbon outside of the Mikdash. One of the items in this list was the fetus of the animal, and we can infer, Hameiman, let's say the offering would be from the meat of the mother animal itself, so chayiv, so apparently there would be a liability for offering the carbon outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Vehechi mashkachas lana, how can this case be found? Biolas nekeva, it must be talking about a female ola, it has to be talking about a carbon ola. And the point over here of the Gemara is that if we're talking about offering the meat of the animal on the Mizbeach, so we can't be talking about a carbon shlamim. The meat of a carbon shlamim is not offered on the Mizbeach. The meat of a carbon shlamim is eaten. We must be talking about the meat of a carbon ola, and we're saying if you take the meat of a carbon ola, you offer it outside the Mikdash, so in such a situation we're going to say that that's considered a liability for offering it outside of the Beis HaMikdash. But if you take the meat, let's say from the fetus of that olas nekeva, so then it's not going to be a liability for offering it outside of the Beis HaMikdash, but we're talking clearly about a female animal. It has to be a female animal because there's a fetus involved, and so therefore you see that an olas nekeva in general must be something which does remain on the Mizbeach, otherwise there wouldn't be a liability for offering it outside of the Mikdash. And so that's what the Gemara now says, Yamrit Bishlam, if you're going to say correctly, Kasav Rabbi Akiva olas nekeva, that Rabbi Akiva holds that when it comes to the olas nekeva, a female animal that's offered as an ola, im also lo tered, that if it goes up on the Mizbeach, it does not come down from the Mizbeach, it's not removed. Hamani Rabbi Akiva he, so then you could say the author of this Brisa is Rabbi Akiva, because again, this Brisa is talking about an olas nekeva, making a distinction between the meat from the fetus and the meat from the mother animal itself, and that distinction would only make sense if you're going to say that an olas nekeva remains on the Mizbeach. That's why there is liability for offering it outside of the Mikdash. Eloi Amridim also tered, but if you're going to say in general an olas nekeva has to be removed, it comes down from the Mizbeach, so there should be no liability for offering it outside of the Mikdash. And so Hamani, so who's the author of this Brisa? And the Gemara continues and answers, Amos say you should rather read the Brisa as follows, Hamala mehen bachutz pater, if he offers from all these parts of the animal outside of the Mikdash exempt, and again included in that list is the fetus of the animal. We are talking about an animal that's a female. Hame emure imon chaye, but if he offers from the sacrificial portions of their mother outside of the Mikdash, then there's a liability. Now once we're talking about the emurim, so we're not talking about the meat of the meat of the animal being offered on the Mizbeach, so we're not talking about a carbon ola anymore. We're talking about something where the meat is eaten, let's say a carbon shlamim, and we're saying by a carbon shlamim, if you offer the emurim, the sacrificial portions, outside of the Beis HaMikdash, there's going to be a liability. But if you offer from the fetus, so then there is no liability outside of the Beis HaMikdash. And once we're interpreting the Brisa in that fashion, so it's not a problem. We're not talking anymore about olas nekeva. We're talking about other kinds of karbanos like shlamim, and therefore this is not a question in terms of who the author of this Brisa is. But the Gemara continues, one second, is it possible to read the Brisa that way? V'ham mehen katani, but the language of the Brisa is you're offering from them, and if you're saying from them, again, let's say from the fetus of the animal, it would include all parts of the fetus, the meat as well. The iman dumya didhu, and then it should be their mother similar to them, and we should be talking about the meat of the animal. And again, if we're talking about the meat of the animal, doesn't that imply we're talking about a carbon-ola, where the meat is normally sacrificed on the Mizbeach, and now you're offering it outside of the Mikdash? And so the Gemara says, Ella rather, Amos say, rather the Brisa should read as follows, Hamala me emurehen bachutz pater, if one offers from the sacrificial portions of, for example, the fetus outside of the Mikdash pater, hame emure imon chaye, but if it's from the sacrificial portions of their mother, then there would be a liability. And Rashi explains, Hamala mehen bachutz, if these are offered outside of the Mikdash, bebraisa de le'el tananla, this again was the Brisa earlier, the katani bashlil, and one of the items was the fetus, umala mehen, and if it says in the Brisa you bring from them, you offer from them outside of the Mikdash, mashma bibasara, that sounds like we're talking from them, meaning the meat. So pater, so if you offer from the meat of the fetus outside of the Mikdash, pater, de lav gufe de zivchu v'lo chazi la'akrava, because that's not a part of the carbon that is chazi lahakrava that's offered, kidatanya bebehema hamekasha, like we say in behema hamekasha and chulin, mayoseres kavod uchloyos v'amurim ba'asham motzim mechlal shalil, af kol motzim mechlal shalil. Again, the shalil is not something that's offered on the mizbeach, and so therefore, if it's offered outside of the mikdash butter, and then we can infer hami besar iman chayev, that would imply that from the meat of the mother animal, there would be a liability offering it outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, where are we going to find the meat of the animal? That again, if you offer the meat of the animal outside of the Mikdash, there's a liability that can only be by a korban ola, and we must be talking about a female animal because we're talking about a fetus in this context. And now, if we're talking about a shlamim, if you offer the meat of a shlamim outside the Mikdash, it's potter. Because that's not something that would be accepted in the Beis HaMikdash. You wouldn't put the meat of a shlamim on the mizbeach. You would eat the meat of a korban shlamim, and so therefore aren't we talking about an olas nekeva? And the only way to understand if we're talking about an olas nekeva is that an olas nekeva is not removed from the mizbeach, and therefore you have to say that Rabbi Akiva goes against what we said in Rabbi Akiva. You have to say that Rabbi Akiva really holds that the olas nekeva is not removed from the mizbeach. Again, hamani Rabbi Akiva, you can say it's Rabbi Akiva if it's not removed. To kevan de bifnimim also loteira, then you could say since inside the mikdash on the mizbeach, if it goes on the mizbeach, it doesn't come down. Mechayev ala b'chutz. So then you could say you're chayev outside of the mikdash. But if you're going to say in Rabbi Akiva tered, if you're going to say in Rabbi Akiva that an olas nekeva comes down from the mizbeach, is removed from the mizbeach, then this brayso is not going to follow any tana. And again, the Gemara then continued and said the brayso is actually talking specifically about the emurim, the sacrificial portions. It's not talking about the meat from the fetus. It's not talking about the meat from the animal, and therefore it could be talking about a korban shlamim or a korban chatos, and it has nothing to do with Rabbi Akiva. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Shachtu al manas l'haniach es damo o emurav l'machar. If a person slaughters the korban in order to leave the blood or the sacrificial portions for tomorrow, so it's not to consume it tomorrow, but just to leave it for tomorrow, o lahotzian lachutz, or similarly to take it outside of the proper place. Rabbi Yehuda posel v'chachamim machshir. And Rabbi Yehuda says disqualified in this situation, and the chachamim say kosher. Again, the chachamim say kosher. It's not a classic case of outside the proper time, outside the proper place, because it's not talking about consuming the korban over here. But again, Rabbi Yehuda in this case does say disqualified. Al manas litnan al gabe hakevish. Let's say it's with the intention to apply the blood on the ramp of the mizbeach, or shelo keneged hayesod, or not corresponding to the yesod, to the base of the mizbeach. V'litan es hanitonim lemalon lemata, or let's say to apply the blood that should have went on the upper part of the mizbeach, on the lower part of the mizbeach. Ves hanitonim lemata lemalon, or again it should have gone on the lower, but he's having intention to apply it on the upper part of the mizbeach. Ves hanitonim, and for those that are applied, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Lamed Vav Amud Aleph.